Hello and welcome to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we rank world leaders and go through what's happened in the last couple of weeks. I'm joined today by Zach.
Hello.
And Georgina.
Hello.
How are you both doing?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, very, very well.
Yeah, how's the last week been with the news?
You
Go on.
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean,
No?
I think it's been actually pretty slow news week last week.
Yeah.
Trump took a sort of a quiet week off in lots of ways, but I think that was quite welcome.
Yeah, I think the last time that I was hosting, basically everybody that we went through on the board was
Related
just
to Trump in some way.
downstream of Trump and what he's been doing. So we'll see whether that's the case this week. So we're going to start with winners this week. Then we're going to move on to the audience suggestion, the losers of the week, and then we'll get on finally to the mechanism, which I'm sure we're all very excited for. So as I say, we'll start with winners of the week. And Zach,
Hello.
do you want to start?
Winner of the week is Argentinian President Javier Milei. I feel like this is slightly overdue in that it's sort of been trickling along. There hasn't been one particular headline that's really grabbed the media, but Milei has made impressive progress since we last talked about him on his quite liberal economic agenda that he's pursuing in Argentina. I mean, people who sort of even glance at the headlines might remember back in sort of 2023 when he was campaigning to be president, he was wielding that massive chainsaw. We had lots of big pledges about dollarizing the Argentinian economy. I think there's a pretty widespread consensus that actually it wasn't going to work and that his plans were just too radical and too furious and too fast. That wasn't a deliberate film reference. But I think it's probably fair to say that, especially in the past couple of months, he's made really quite impressive progress. And specifically here, I'm talking about his loosening of capital controls. He has, for the first time in really, really quite a long time, unified the unofficial and official rate for the peso. So for a bit of context, on years, the Argentinian government has basically used a really complicated system of capital controls and sort of imposed very, very stringent restrictions on exporters to basically try and pretend that the peso is worth more than it actually is, right? And that created this black market for pesos where it was trading its actual value. And there was a massive difference between these two things, right? Sometimes the black market peso was literally a third of the value of the peso that the government was claiming it was. You see what I mean? No one was optimistic about his ability to basically end those capital controls and get rid of the official rate and let the peso trade freely. But after negotiating a big loan with the IMF, he let it float, and it basically turns out the peso is a lot stronger than lots of people expected. This is great news for Milei, both because obviously a stronger peso means he doesn't have to dip into his limited foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency. It also means lower inflation because obviously imports are less expensive to Argentinian households. But I think the more broadly and the most important point to make here is it reflects a genuine confidence in Argentina's economy. And that is that's the one thing that Milei needs to maintain if he's going to succeed in his sort of radical, quite right-wing economic agenda. He needs to maintain investor confidence, right? He wants to liberalize the Argentinian economy. He wants to open it up. And he hopes that will sort of via free markets make Argentina more productive and ultimately wealthier. But obviously the big risk with opening up those sorts of economies is that if investors suddenly get a bit anxious, they look at Argentina's recent economic history and go, oh, this probably isn't going to work out. You can have this massive capital flight, which is the sort of thing that will bring down Argentinian governments and has done in the past.
So with that, I suppose there was a assumption when Milei got in that he might not be able to go as far with his agenda. There's now some evidence that he's been able to do that he's sort of meeting those targets. Do you think this is going to embolden him? If so, what do you think happens next? What do you think happens now with his sort of agenda? If if there is now confidence in especially the economy, what do you think his next moves are?
So the most important thing for Milei coming up is the midterms, which I think are in October, right? And at the moment, he has pretty minimal congressional representation, which means that he's had to enact his policies via a combination of essentially executive decrees and sort of interparliamentary haggling, right? And he'll be hoping that at those midterms, his party, Libertad Avanza, I think it is, will win enough seats to make it so that he can he has more legislative power, right? And he doesn't have to rely on limited executive decrees, essentially. And I think there are signs that he could pull that off, right? His poll numbers dipped briefly a couple of weeks ago, I think in large part because of the cryptocurrency scandal at the end of last year, I think it was, or maybe at the start of this year. But actually they've ticked up a bit in literally the past week or so. And there was a sort of local election in Buenos Aires recently where his candidate massively outperformed the polls. And I think quite importantly, the main opposition bloc really underperformed, right? And I think, he'll take some inspiration from that result. And that also plays into this whole point I was making about investor confidence, right? In that, like, one of the reasons investors might get a bit nervous is if they thought that Milei was going to lose the next elections, right? And that then there would be, the Congress would basically get in his way and stop him make any further reforms, and Argentina would revert back to the sort of like the Peronism of pre-Milei. And if he can maintain his approval ratings and convince investors that there's a good chance that he will prevail at the midterms, that should in turn reinforce investor confidence. I can feel quite sort of neoliberal and right wing talking so much about investor confidence. And I think, in normal times, I don't want to politicians spend all of their mental and political energies appeasing the bond markets. But I think in Argentina's case,
I think you do. I think that is exactly what you want them to do.
I think in Argentina's case, it is a particularly acute risk, right? Just because just so obvious. Like, it's just imagine you're an investor. You're going to be very nervy getting back into that market, given the history, and so you're going to be very sort of quick to pull all your money out. And obviously.
Georgina, have you got anything to add here?
No.
Nope. Okay.
Sorry.
Move on.
Yeah. So, Georgina, who's your winner of the week?
My winner this week is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This is a rare moment where we can talk about a success for Ukraine's leader at the moment. And this is because of a coordinated drone strike operation on 4 Russian air bases deep inside Russia. And when we say deep inside Russia, a couple of them were 200 to 300 kilometers away from Moscow, so fairly close to Ukraine geographically. One was very far north, and one was way out in southeastern Siberia, so genuinely thousands of miles away from Ukraine. And this was an operation that was 18 months in the planning to execution. And with over 100 drones, Ukraine has successfully destroyed or damaged at least 40 out of 120 Russian strategic bombing aircraft. And although this won't make that much of a difference to the fighting that's still taking place on the front lines, in terms of hurting Russian military confidence, kind of projecting, we can carry out this very complex, coordinated attack for Ukraine, and also, I guess, like, just giving Russia a bit of a shock. This is a win for Zelensky militarily. But this is also an opportunity, I think, to talk about the ongoing peace deal. Today on Monday, a Ukrainian delegation is meeting with Russian officials in Istanbul for peace talks. And this is only the second direct talks that Ukraine and Russia have had with each other since 2022. And Ukraine has drafted a proposal for a ceasefire, which is an unconditional ceasefire at land, sea, and in the air. It also, they've made very clear that international countries shouldn't accept Russia's territorial claims to Ukrainian land. Basically, we'll have to see what comes of this over the next few days, but I thought it was an opportunity to talk about it today.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things on that as well. I think in terms of the number of aircraft that was destroyed, I think it's hard to verify the exact numbers, but I think Ukraine had claimed that the damage was worth something like $8 billion, something like that. It was some ridiculously high amount because they destroyed some strategic nuclear bombers in that, some of which were built so many years ago that they predict they can't be rebuilt, which is obviously quite a not only a sort of monetary loss, but a symbolic loss as well. So I think that's sort of worth bringing up, just the sort of financial cost to Russia of these attacks. But in addition to that, I suppose Ukraine have been feeling a little bit pushed out by the Americans, and almost like the Americans' negotiating position has been that Ukraine has lost the war, therefore the terms are more favourable to Russia. So I suppose this, for them, it's the sort of trying to reframe the peace negotiation talks and try and give them, because there was a lot of talk from Ukrainians yesterday of cards, right, referring back to this phrase that Trump had used in that that White House meeting, saying we actually do have some cards to play. And as you say, 18 months in the making. And I think Zelensky had some personal involvement in the operation itself, I think, which is quite significant. So it was a really big day for Ukraine. Zach, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on this, particularly for the sort of peace negotiation side of things.
I was just going to say, I think a point you made just then was really, really well. It's very insightful. Is that I think that is exactly how the Ukrainians feel about the American attitude to negotiating, and I think this was laid really bare. There was an interview a couple of months ago where, for ages, basically, journalists have been trying to push Vance and Trump on, why do you think that your proposed peace deal is fair? It looks like you give all these concessions to Russia and none to Ukraine, right? It just looks unbalanced, right? And a journalist asked, I think it was Trump, what concessions are you actually giving Putin here? And he said, the concession that Putin is making is that he's not taking over the whole country, right? And I think you're right. It goes to show that the American attitude thus far has been that Ukraine has lost the war. And, if basically this is allowed to play out, it will end in Russia taking over all of Ukraine, which I don't think I just think that's just a bad reading of the facts on the ground. And I think there are actually a whole lot of other reasons now that we're talking about it, that Zelensky has had a relatively good couple of weeks, right? I think on the whole American thing, on the whole Trump thing, it does look like Trump is turning on Putin a little bit recently. And I think there's something we've, in lots of ways, foreseen on the channel. I don't want to be too smug about it, but the fundamental issue here is that Trump wants some sort of deal. There is no deal that really is acceptable to Putin, save for basically it looks like taking all of Ukraine. Although I would note one little caveat here. There was a very interesting comment by a Kremlin spokesperson a couple of weeks ago that didn't really get reported on, where he did seem to imply that actually Russia would accept a freeze along the current front lines, right? Which is something that Putin sort of said he would accept a while ago, and then he went back on it. And it now looks like maybe they're back on those, back at that sort of point. The other thing is that, and this isn't important at all, but it is true, is that actually Russia's rate of advance on the battlefield has slowed down. There were some advances in literally the past couple of days, but actually for the past 3-4 months or so, if you just take like the aggregate amount of territory that Russia has captured, it's been very, very minimal. And I think most importantly, the next big battle in Ukraine was supposed to be Pokrovsk, which is a sort of strategic hub in Donbass, right? But we've been talking about Pokrovsk now for a year and a bit, right? And the Russians have come and been pushed back. There was a big pushback actually earlier this year by the Ukrainians when it looked like Russia was going to encircle the town, and then they were pushed back on those two sort of prongs, right, by the Ukrainians. And the fact that, we're still not, there's still not actually a direct battle inside Pokrovsk, that really goes to show you quite how much the Russian advance has stalled. I mean, it really is a bit of a stalemate on the front lines. That's not to say there aren't, Russia doesn't enjoy certain structural advantages to do with manpower and air power, obviously. But it is nonetheless true that actually the rate of advance has slowed even further than it already was. It was already pretty snail pace.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fair to say then that this attack was sort of deliberately timed in and amongst all of that. Because if Russia's already stalling on the battlefield and we're going into peace talks, another sort of attack like this from Ukraine, it just builds into this wider narrative that Ukraine are actually the people that are advancing and sort of giving them more of those cards in that sort of
what I would say is I think what is happening clearly is that ahead of peace talks, both sides are trying to assert the upper hand.
Exactly.
Right? That's why the sort of rate of airstrikes on Ukrainian cities and towns has increased recently. So, as you might have seen glancing at the headlines, there have been a series of massive air raids on places like Kiev recently. But yeah, equally, that's why the Ukrainians would have timed this attack on Russian aircraft as they have done, right? In that if there's been 18 months in the works, they clearly saved it up for a little bit so they could have it just before they go into peace talks to sort of, try and assert the upper hand, just give themselves some leverage and try and convince the Russians that there are downsides to not accepting some sort of ceasefire.
Yeah.
One final thing to add, if I can, is that I forgot to mention before, but also as part of this Ukrainian proposed ceasefire deal, Zelensky has also agreed to meet Putin face to face, which is also an interesting development because that's something that hasn't happened and that Zelensky has refused to do, and that potentially people who are saying, oh, well, the Ukrainians are the ones obstructing peace could say, well, obviously Zelensky is refusing to meet Putin, but if that's no longer the case, once again, it becomes clear who really is obstructing the deal.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to something that, again, we've been talking about for a while, right? In that with Trump, the game to play is just to prove to him, the game Zelensky has to play is just to prove to him that he is not fundamentally the obstacle to peace. And, to that end, do stuff that he might consider bad politics in some sense, but that is fundamental to demonstrate to Trump that actually at the end of the day, it's Putin's intransigence that is going to, get in the way of any potential peace deal.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see how the negotiations go in the next couple of days and obviously over the next few weeks as well. But we'll move on now to the audience suggestion for the week. So one of the top comments on the podcast last week was Jonas Gahr Støre, the Norwegian Prime Minister.
Thanks to whoever suggested this. I want to say I think this is the best audience suggestion we've had on this podcast so far. I was shocked he wasn't even on the board already, because he seems like, a world leader that we should talk about. I think great suggestion, whoever suggested it. I don't know what the comment said, so I'm probably repeating some of your reasoning. So I think we should definitely move Jonas Gahr Støre up. It's quite an amazing reversal of fortunes for the Norwegian Labour Party. Essentially, two things happened at the start of 2025, which have led to really a huge surge in the polls at the expense of both the Conservative Party and the populist right-wing Progress Party. And you can trace the line back when you look at the graphs to January, so right at the start of this year. And in January, the Norwegian Centre Party left the governing coalition with the Labour Party. And this was because of disagreements over energy, the fact that the Labour Party wanted to align Norway's energy directives more closely with those of the EU. But the Centre Party, which is very Eurosceptic, was opposing this over a period of months. And so, the Norwegian press was talking about this, politics stalling because nothing was getting through Parliament because of these blockages and infighting in the coalition. Obviously, people watching that can see what's going on and are losing faith in the leadership of Støre. And then eventually the Centre Party left. But paradoxically, this actually left Labour in a far better position as a kind of pure Labour government, because they weren't dealing with this infighting so much. And the second thing that happened was Støre shook up his cabinet, brought in former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And Stoltenberg was a massive international superstar back in the day. He's very popular within Norway.
He was also Norwegian Prime Minister.
And he was Norwegian Prime Minister, of course. And so Støre brought in Stoltenberg as his finance minister, which was honestly, you look at the polls now, and that was a masterstroke, because he has single-handedly effectively reinvigorated the party, reinvigorated the public's trust in the government. And even, interestingly, the leader of the populist right-wing Progress Party, Sylvi Listhaug, even said when Stoltenberg came back, she congratulated him and said, something like, "Isn't it great that it's good to welcome you back to politics?" So it's quite an amazing story, really. And just to signal how much these fortunes have shifted, back in September, when the Labour Party was trailing in the polls, it seemed like in a year's time, so September 2025, we're expecting the next parliamentary elections. It seemed a given that Labour would lose that election, or at the very least would possibly be able to scrape together some kind of minority government. But now Støre is talking about actually, having a strong Labour kind of majority government, or a pure Labour government next time round, which, again, a few months ago, you really could not have imagined at all.
Yeah.
So there's my
No, I'm going to let you go first. I completely agree. I think that's great. Yeah. And also, when you get to that point as a political party and a politician, where you can claim to the voters that actually, if you vote for us, there is a chance that you get, either a sort of sufficiently large but still minority pure Labour government, or an outright majority. That's a great thing to be able to tell voters, right? You get stuck in feedback loops in either direction, because when you have enough, you can be like, oh no, this is your chance of stable government. And when you sort of fall far down in the polls, all of a sudden people start going, oh, if I vote for them, I'm actually voting for instability. It's very, something very familiar here in the UK, that dynamic. Yeah.
Another factor that possibly plays into this, but I'm not sure what you think, is, do you think this is potentially also another example of the anti-Trump effect in Norwegian politics, where you've got, because Norway and the US militarily, in terms of defense, going back to the origins of NATO, have been partners for a long time. And in the same way that Trump's comments about NATO have have affected election results in
in Australia, Canada, for instance, and then more recently, probably fair to say more recently,
in the European politics,
in Germany as well, because I think that actually that probably hurt the AfD in certain ways. I think maybe, and it does actually fit with the timing, right? In that like Labour's surge in the polls happens in January, and that is when Trump really starts spouting off.
Yeah.
I think there's probably something to that. I think it's probably also that like it's made the national security risks more acute. Anxieties about Russia have definitely risen as Trump has arrived on the scene, and some of his sort of conspicuously pro-Putin rhetoric has made people a bit nervy. And I think that in those times when electorates are focused on national security risks, that's always just good for an incumbent government, right? It's all, and you always get to talk about how you're going to increase defense spending, and everyone likes that. And in Norway, you're in an especially nice position because you can talk about how you're going to increase defense spending, and you don't have the awkward question of how to pay for it because you just have an enormous sovereign wealth fund.
Certainly helps.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's the issue here in the UK, right? And everyone likes the whole 3% on GDP, but
they don't like cutting welfare to pay for it.
Exactly. There you go. And then also, you can see how difficult this is for Starmer right now because we have the defense review right today, being published today, and he hasn't given a date for when that 3% target is actually going to happen. And that is a symptom of the fact that the finances are tight.
They've weakened it as well, suggesting that it's sort of a vague target, not a plan. So they're already starting to row back slightly on it.
Well, whereas in Norway, you have a 2 trillion euro sovereign wealth fund to sit back on, which just means you can do whatever you want, really. It's actually a bit embarrassing as a Norwegian government to collapse because you got infinite money. What are you doing? I'm sure it's not that simple. Sorry. The one other thing I think is interesting about this. Maybe there's two more generally interesting things, but I think that the appeal of Stoltenberg is interesting because it speaks to this like collective nostalgia that we all apparently have in politics at the moment. You see this with Mark Carney, right? In that like. And Mario Draghi to a lesser extent, and maybe even Boris Johnson. It's the return of these sort of politicians from the 2010s and maybe even beyond that. They're welcomed back so enthusiastically. I think it goes to show quite how much we sort of all, yearn for
nostalgia
the good old
for the
days
past.
of austerity. Oh, and that was the main problem, And the last other thing is I do think that the energy spat that Norway had with the EU is interesting because it was fundamentally about sharing energy. I mean, it ended up being focused on the question of whether or not Norway should adopt these EU directives, but the original point of tension was Norwegian energy prices going up because Norway was exporting its energy surplus to Europe via these interconnectors. I mean, interestingly, by the way, part of the new Brexit deal was that we basically want to make better use of our interconnectors with Europe. And I do think that's interesting because I think that it speaks to this quite deep problem in Europe, and Europe is energy constrained in lots of ways, and the only way that Europe is going to have reasonably low energy prices and survive the transition or even just an era of high oil prices is by making sure there are enough sort of connectors that demand and supply can be sort of balanced across the continent, right? When the sun isn't shining in Germany, they can get it from the nuclear power in France. And I just think that it's interesting that one of the anxieties for Europe as a whole should be that when energy prices go up, you do see energy nationalism kick in, right? You see that in France as well. And people saying, why are we sharing our nuclear power? And the game has to be to just keep a lid on that and just try and make sure people don't get too stressed out about it because it will only make the problem worse for in the aggregate, right? Especially for Europe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's fair to say we're moving Sturday up.
Yes, definitely.
This week. That's the conclusion we've come to. Good. So we'll move on and we'll just talk very quickly about our next magazine, which should be coming out in, fair to say a couple of months, 2-3 months-ish. We're still writing it at the minute, but the overall focus of this magazine is the American hegemony. And I think for people watching this podcast, obviously a lot of what we talk about every week on here is the downstream effects of Trump, of him trying to sort of maintain America's standing on the world stage. So if you are interested in that, and I'd suggest if you do watch this podcast, you probably are, then this I really do think is sort of the edition for you. I know we've done some sort of interesting magazines before, but this one I think is really topical, really tied to the news cycle. I know that you both have some quite interesting articles that you're sort of working on at the minute. I mean, if either of you want to sort of tease one of those to the audience a little bit, or...
I'm just thinking out loud now that this will be a cool edition to look back on, in future. If you like collecting things, as, a sign of what's happening right now that you can look back on in 5 years' time and be like, oh my God, what a time that was.
Yeah, that's true.
Then this is the thing to get.
Yeah.
I can say one little pitch for it.
Yeah.
I do think in general, there's what's I think could be quite nice about the magazine in its final form is that there is this general sense that American, hegemony is on the decline. But that's a very broad stroke claim, right? And that actually, what I think that magazine might do quite well is sort of individuate the ways in which American power is waxing and waning. There are lots of ways, obviously, where American power is on the decline, but there are some ways that it's sort of still on the up, right? And like how that all plays out in the aggregate is the big question.
Yeah.
But I think that individuating, that broad sense that lots of people have about, American hegemony being on the decline, I think that's an interesting element of the magazine.
So, I mean, if the audience want to individuate the waxing and waning of the American hegemony, this is the magazine for them. So you can find that at toolong.news. And anyway, before Zach gets more angry at me, we'll move on.
That's going to need bleeping.
We'll move on to the losers of the week. Okay, so Zach, we'll be moving on and we're going to losers of the week. So we'll start with yours.
My big loser of the week is European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. I know I moved her up last week, but she is going down for a number of reasons. I think the most acute issue for her right now is the Polish election, where the sort of anti-EU candidate, insofar as there's one relatively pro-EU and one relatively anti-EU, the anti-EU right-wing candidate just won, and that throws a spanner in the works. Obviously, it's not bad news for Europe in and of itself, but I think it's particularly frustrating for von der Leyen because I think there was a hope in Brussels that with Orban behind in the polls, it's worth noting that Robert Fico, who's another sort of troublemaker in the EU, his coalition is, for the first time in really quite a long time, behind in the polls to the opposition party. Those are not election due for a while. And the Romanian election, where the relatively pro-EU candidate also won, there was a hope that maybe the EU was in for a period of relative stability, but that does not look like it's coming to fruition at the moment, especially if law and justice reassert themselves in Poland. But then there's the one other issue I think is worth mentioning is China, and we did a whole video on this over on TLDR EU. But there are points of tension in the EU-China relationship, which was seen by some as a sort of hedge to Trump, especially to do with trade and the fact that European anxieties about Chinese exports undercutting European industry, but then also Ukraine, right? In that there was hope that maybe this rapprochement between China and the EU would be able to push Xi into taking a stronger stance on Russia and Ukraine, but so far that hasn't happened.
Okay, so instead of carrying on, just going into yours a bit more there, Zach, we'll move on to your loser of the week, Georgina, because I think it's quite related.
Yeah, so my loser of the week is Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And this follows on nicely from what Zach was talking about, because at the weekend we had the Polish presidential election, which was very narrowly won by the candidate from the right-wing Law and Justice Party, Karol Nawrocki, with 50.9%. And then about 2 points behind was the candidate from Tusk's centrist Civic platform, which was Rafał Trzaskowski with 49.1%. And actually, the first exit poll that came out suggested that the Civic platform was going to win. And then as the hours went on and more votes came in, the fortunes changed. And actually, it was the Law and Justice Party that won. And this is bad for Tusk for several reasons. It firstly extends this long-running power struggle in Polish domestic politics between the kind of centre or the centre-left and the populist right. Secondly, it jeopardizes Tusk's liberal reform agenda. So for context, Tusk won the 2023 Polish election, promising to come in and undo the kind of democratic backsliding that had happened under the previous Law and Justice government. But that is now going to be thrown into disarray by this president who's going to be fighting Tusk on every kind of liberal reform that he wants to push through. But third, it's also going to weaken Poland's position in the EU. And so in recent weeks, we've seen Tusk hanging out with Macron, Merz and Starmer and Zelensky, all five of them trying to project this image of European unity, of like the liberal future of Europe, strength for Ukraine, strength on the economy, strength against Russia and against Trump. And now that Tusk is dealing with this domestic political turmoil, it's thrown him way back to a place that he really doesn't want to be.
So we'll sort of move on. We'll sort of put those two sort of together and we can sort of discuss them. So I think it's fair to say that that has undermined the sort of like liberal agenda, I suppose, in Poland. And do you want to talk a little bit more about like what how that sort of relates to the rest of Europe and whether that sort of fits in to what we're seeing in the rest of Europe at the minute? I know, Zach, you were talking a little bit about this when you were talking about von der Leyen. So
yeah, I mean, I think all of this is very, very true, right? And it's clearly a bad result for Tusk, and it's clearly a bad result for the EU, or at least for anyone in Brussels who wants a deeper European integration. But I do think one important caveat is worth mentioning here, and I think it's something that's often overlooked, especially in like the Western press, is that Tusk sometimes can look like your sort of archetypal, pro-European. But actually, Tusk is not as furiously pro-European as we might assume, given that he was at the head of the Commission at some point, wasn't he? And you saw this, and again, when you have those like photo ops, right? When it's Starmer, Tusk, Macron, or maybe a better example is Macron, Tusk, Merz, sometimes that gets folded into this whole thing about like, Poland being like the new center of Europe. And I think some of that is true just by virtue of the fact that the Polish economy is doing pretty well and the Polish military is very big by European standards. But I think it's important to note that like Tusk and his actual sort of revealed politics is not a European integrationist in the way that say Macron is at all. And I think you saw this. And a couple of things, especially to do with Ukraine, right? I mean, Tusk came out and said very explicitly there will be no European army. He was the first big leader to do that, and that was a bit of a shock. Well, to people who hadn't been really paying attention. But then also more recently, he's refused to deploy troops in Ukraine. You saw that as well. And actually, his rhetoric on Ukraine has been ambivalent, to say the best. He has his complaints with Ukraine, and actually they reflect the median Polish opinion. Polish public opinion is not very pro-Ukraine at the moment. It's very furiously anti-Russia, right? But not necessarily that pro-Ukraine. And I think this speaks to this fact that actually, again, we might see Tusk as this sort of archetypal European. Actually, he's just constrained by where Polish public opinion is, right? And it turns out that both the questions on Ukraine and Europe, the EU, and what the EU should look like, Poles are not that enthusiastic. And I think there is quite, Poland does not, your median Pole does not see the current European Union as a sort of stepping stone to a deeper Europe in the way that I think Macron sort of envisages it. They see it mainly as an economic bloc as opposed to like a political union, or at least the Polish political class sees it in those terms.
Do you think we're seeing that across Europe generally at the minute, or is that sort of specifically Poland?
I think what's really interesting here, and I think I'm actually stealing this idea a little bit from I think Wolfgang Wunschau, who's the writer at Euro Intelligence, who did a very good podcast on this recently. But I think what this does speak to is that actually, for a while, I think people have thought the main dividing line in European politics during the Eurozone crisis was north-south, right? In the frugal northern states and slightly less frugal southern states. But actually, the real dividing line, I think, at the moment in Europe ideologically is east-west, and that most of those post-Soviet, post-communist countries that joined in the 2000s, beginning really in 2004, including Poland, see the European Union as just an economic project. It's just a single market, right? That's the whole point. It's there to boost GDP. Whereas I think at least part of the political class in places like France, Germany, to a lesser extent maybe, Spain, I mean, the Netherlands, probably a better example, Belgium, have at least hope that one day the European Union will become more of a political project, right? That's the whole point in the European Parliament. That's the sort of original rationale behind it, right? And that's when the European Union was first constructed. It was, the language is ever closer union. The idea is that Europe sort of slowly comes together over time to eventually become essentially one big European nation state in lots of ways, right? To rival, originally America and now America and China. And like, there is just this quite stark divide between the East and the West on this point, in that very few Eastern European politicians think of Europe like that. And you see this again in the Polish case, right? In that, like, when it comes to where the big political parties in Poland stand on the EU, sure, there are some pretty Eurosceptic ones like Law and Justice, and then Confederation, which is really, really Eurosceptic. But it's not like the Civic Coalition are furiously, they're not like Macron, right? They're not saying, oh, we should commit to a European army, we should sort of, massively increase payments to Europe, and then we should bring in, I don't know, you know what I mean? There's none of that, there's no enthusiasm for that, right? There's sort of spectrum of Euroscepticism in Poland goes from like sort of ambivalent about Europe to very Eurosceptic. Whereas in places like, I don't know, France, it goes from sort of furiously pro-Europe strategic autonomy down to Eurosceptic. Do you see that's the point I'm trying to make here?
Yeah. No, I think it makes sense. I mean, Georgina, do you have anything you want to add on that point in particular?
Not on that point in particular, but in relation, going back to your original question and kind of how this affects Europe more widely, there's also been some discussion, some media outlets are framing this as MAGA's first victory in Europe kind of thing, because the US Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem last week, when she was in Poland, encouraged Poles to vote for Nawrocki, the Law and Justice candidate. And, we've seen similar issues like in Romania with the Trump administration being very pro, the nationalist candidate. And Viktor Orban also in Hungary was was the biggest voice to come out immediately in support of this new president in Poland. And I guess Orban himself is obviously trailing in the polls now, fearing what might happen at the 2026 elections, whether he'll lose out to this new, more liberal, younger upstart guy, Peter Magyar. So we'll have to see whether this is just, whether it was ultimately just a knife edge result that doesn't really reflect that many shifts in Europe, or whether similar things may also happen in Hungary. Who knows? But again, it fits in with what Zach was saying a bit about the split, Western-Eastern split in Europe. But let's also remember that Hungary and Poland are both Central European countries, so they're in this weird place, kind of. They're not fully Eastern Europe, but they're definitely not Western Europe in the sense that France and Germany are. So there's all of these shifts going on underneath.
I think that that picks up on a really important point that I didn't make. That was that the part of this East-West divide is also that the Eastern European countries. Again, I'm using the word East here quite loosely. Right? I don't think any country identifies as Eastern Europe, but they're just Eastern European countries just tend to be more pro-US generally, right? And that's in part a historical artifact, but it's also that they just don't trust France and Germany to defend them in the same way that they trust the US to via NATO. That's why, again, Tusk's rhetoric on this whole European strategic autonomy, European army has been, muted to say the least. It's just quite fundamentally, Poland has always thought that America is the only real guarantor of its security, and that the French and the Germans just can't really pull it off.
Yeah.
Honestly, there was some of the it doesn't really get mentioned in the like, I don't want to diss the Western press. I sound like one of those sort of right-wing lunatics. But some of the rhetoric you see from Polish politicians about France and Germany is really quite furious. I think when Nord Stream was first agreed, the Polish foreign minister described it as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And more recently, when the first American LNG shipments arrived in Poland, right, because Poland has hated the fact that the Germans and the rest of Europe were reliant on Russian gas because they didn't trust the Russians. I think that then the Polish foreign minister said, this is the first day of Poland is truly independent. And that's, that you don't sort of, but my point here is that the Polish political class thinks about Europe so differently to, let's say, the French political class or soppy liberals like myself.
Okay, so we'll move on to the winners, the ultimate winner and ultimate loser of the week, also known as the mechanism. So in order for a person to move up an extra place or move down an extra place, we need all three of us to agree that they're the ultimate winner or loser of the week. So it needs to be a unanimous decision. So we'll start off with the ultimate winner of the week, and we have three options this week. We have Zelensky, Millet, and Sture. So, Zach, who's your winner of the week?
I just think there's no competition. It has to be Zelensky, doesn't it? I mean,
well, we're about to find out.
It's going to be Sture.
Georgina, does it have to be Zelensky this week?
It does have to be Zelensky.
Yeah. And I agree, it does indeed have to be
the mechanism
Zelensky.
Comes through.
So the mechanism has come through. So that is the ultimate winner of this week, which means he moves up an extra place. And now we'll move on to the overall loser of the week. And the options are Donald Tusk and von der Leyen.
I mean, it's helped by only having two people, but I think we might pull off a double mechanism.
Wow.
Would that be unprecedented?
I think it would be unprecedented. I use that word sparingly.
Is it unprecedented, Zach? So let's start.
Come on,
Tusk.
it has to be Donald Tusk.
Here we go.
It has to be Donald Tusk.
It has to be.
It has to be Donald Tusk. There we go.
This is also
A
the
double-
first time, by the way, we've ever done the mechanism where none of us have justified our decisions. We've just, it has to be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll be interested to see whether the audience agrees with our decisions here. I'm sure
Wow.
there'll be some inevitably that won't. But we've got a double move 2 people this week.
Yeah.
So we've got Zelensky moving up again and Tusk moving down again. So yeah, big week this week. Yeah.
Slightly
It is
soft
a big
ending.
Yeah, it is quite a soft ending.
We should just cut there. Big week this week.
Yeah, it is a big week this week. Yeah, exactly. So we'll see if next week's another big week. So we've got the World Leaderboard again next Monday, and we have an episode of Starmageddon in between that. So yeah, join again next week. So thank you for joining, Zach and Georgina.
Thank you.
Good.